So we'll go for the study of poetry written by Matthew Arnold. So study of poetry is a critical essay which is written by Matthew Arnold. In this essay, Arnold criticizes the art of poetry as well as the art of criticism. Now we understand that art of poetry.
You're mute, I guess.
Oh my goodness, thank you, thank you. You guess, you're sure. Now it's clear. Am I visible and also audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we are going to discuss a study of poetry, which is written by Matthew Arnold. What this essay is telling to us, this essay which gives us the idea and where or in which Matthew Arnold criticizes. Now, you understand the term called as a criticizes or criticism. It means when you draw some of the feedback from the art of poetry, right, as well as the art of criticism. Matthew Arnold believes that the art of poetry is capable of what? High destinies. When we talk about, he believes that the art of poetry is capable of high destinies, it means he tries to tell us the apex of the poetry or the qualities of the poetry. It is the art. Here, art refers to the two of the meaning. One is called as the skill, and the other one is called as a painting, and the other one is called as a means art pertinent to the skill lies in the poetry, right? So it is the art in which the idea itself is the fact, right? He says that we should understand the value or the worth of poetry, as it is poetry that shows us a mirror of life. If you talk about that, what does it mean when he says that art carries the worth of poetry, right? Or we should understand the worth of poetry. So he is trying to say that poetry shows us a mirror of life. How? Now, science, according to Arnold, is incomplete without poetry. Now, look into it. Through this, the poet or the writer, Matthew Arnold, makes a kind of a comparison. The comparison with arts with the science. According to Arnold, he said that science is incomplete without poetry, but poetry is a complete one. And religion and philosophy will give way to the poetry. So it means you can say without poetry and religion and philosophy, right? So science is somehow considered as the incomplete one. But at the same time, poetry is given a weight by the religion and philosophy. Arnold terms poetry as a criticism of life. Poetry as a criticism of life means what? Now, he pointed that when we write the poems, we try to experience the life. We try to present the life, thereby refuting the accusation of Plato. It means you can say Matthew Arnold's had a contrast or disagreement opinion against or disagreement opinion on Plato's statements. And he says that as the time goes on, man will continue to find comfort and solace in poetry. So based on the continuation of time, right, what happened means comfort and solace in poetry. So you will find out the human being will find out the comfortability and the imagination in poetry. Arnold says that when one reads poetry, he tends to estimate, means his interest to invest whether it is of the best form or not. So poetry is the best form or not. It happens in a three ways. As far as I told you, the real estimate, the historic estimate, and the personal estimate. These are the three ways that Arnold presents that poetry can be estimated or poetry can be defined. So what is that real estimate, personal estimate, and historic estimate? Let's go one by one. So it's a very clear-cut thought. At the beginning of the stage, we understand that Matthew Arnold's view on the poetry, he criticizes the art of poetry as well as the art of criticism. So it means he makes two of the ideas, means art of poetry and art of criticism. On both of the topics, the poet, the writer, Matthew Arnold give his criticism, right? Second is what? Second is called as a, means he pointed art of poetry is based on the destinies, and he also pointed it is fact, and he also makes a comparison between art of poetry with the science. He points out religion and philosophy will give way to poetry, whereas the science is incomplete without poetry. His disagreement on Plato's statement, and he pointed that when time continues, a human being will understand the comfort and solace in poetry. These are the points, right? Arnold also tries to give us the three of the estimate through which an art of poetry can be considered whether the best form or not. So those of the estimates are called as a real estimate, historic estimate, and the personal estimate. What is that real estimate? Now, real estimate is an unbiased viewpoint. Unbiased viewpoint means what? Now, when you are not biased with any of the situation, right? When you are not imitating anyone's idea, when you are not following historic thought, right? So based on the William Wordsworth, so poetry is something which is, voluntary, right? So similar to that, Matthew Arnold wants to convey the message that poetry should not be biased viewpoint. So, or whenever you give the criticism on poetry, you should not be biased, as you must not think. So, William Wordsworth or William Shakespeare are the famous poet on their own era. So that's why their poetry presents a good sense or good essence. You should not, go for the biased on viewpoint. So even the poet, the writer also said, unbiased viewpoint that takes into account both the historical context and the creative faculty to judge the worth of poetry. So anyone can write poems, right? So, and all these poems do have the value. We should not consider that the poem is written by a poet or the particular person belonging to the different era and having his or her personal value, and based on that we judge the poem. No. So at the same time, the poet also, the writer Matthew Arnold indicates about the historic estimate that places the historical context about the value of the art itself. So the data presents that the poem belongs to the very old, and the kind of a language is pointed into it, right? Those of the things gives its own worth, right? So the personal estimate, on the other hand, depends on the personal taste. So I like romantic poems, so I would go for that. I like ballad. That's why I read the poems which have been referred by certain poets. I like means ode, sonnet. So these are called as a different types of taste of an individual. Personal taste, we used to say. The likes and dislikes of the reader, which affects his judgment, right? So specifically, you people are also belonging to one particular department, but having with a variety of tests on variety of points. So some say that I like P.V. Shelley's poem, and some will say that I like means again. Okay. So some say that what I again. Some say at the same time that what, yep. So some say that they like the kind of a poem which is given the idea about, let's say that I'm giving you the variety of different variety of poems. Let's say if you talk about S.T. Coleridge written the Ancient of, the Ancient Mariner, right? So this is one of the ballad. If you talk about William Wordsworth written one of the sonnet, which is called as a Daffodils, again means different text. If you talk about means the poem referring to the stopping by the woods on a snowy evening, right? Robert Lee Frost. So different text referring to the nature, right? So what do we observe? Now we observe that they all have been referred to the personal estimate, examples of the personal estimate. On the other hand, you would find out means poem referring to the elegy or called as a melancholy, right? Let's say if you talk about the poem which is indicating towards the Alfred Tennyson, right? So that called as a strange meeting, right? It is indicating one of the elegy. So what it tries to tell us, it tries to tell us the personal estimate where people have depended upon the personal taste, the likes and dislikes of the reader, which affects his judgment of poetry. Arnold says that both these estimates tend to be fallacious. Arnold says that both these estimates means he doesn't refer to the historical, he doesn't refer to the personal. He points out that these are nothing but fallacious in the sense called as a wrong, error, right? Error of judgment. The historic and personal estimates often overshadow means going, trying to hide the real estimate. What is the real estimate? The real estimate is called as unbiased. But Arnold also says that it is natural, right? Like how could you point out upon others' interest? So others' interest is natural. The study of the historical background of poetry, and its development often leads to the critic skipping over the shortcomings because of its historical importance, right? Historic estimate raises poetry to a high pedestal and therefore creates barrier one from noticing its weaknesses. That's what the writer Matthew Arnold tries to say. It is the historic estimate that leads to the creation of classics and raises the poet to a nearly godlike standard. So at the same time, some also, when read the poems, right, of historic estimates, that creates the mind of the human being, hiding the actuality and identifying the identifying what he believes, right? So even one unable to understand the weaknesses, because he believes that it is written during the past time. So, and he takes the poet into the godlike standard. Arnold says that if a poet is truly a classic, his poetry will give the reader real pleasure and enable him to compare and contrast other poetry which are not of the same high standard. So obviously, it completely depends upon the poet. If the poet is a natural, poetry is truly a classic on his poetry, so definitely his writing will give happiness to the poet, reader. And reader will make the differentiation, the reader will make the compare and contrast the poet with the other poet and their writing, which will give the which are not of the same high standard. This, according to Arnold, is the real estimate of poetry, and that's why he points out it completely depends upon the readers and their taste, as well as the poets and the poetry. Those are therefore Arnold appeals to his readers to read classics. Now, understand that, right? He takes the side of the classics and stated that he suggested his readers to read classics with an open eye, not to be blind to its faults, right? You should not ignore the errors lies in the classics. You should see the factuality. This will enable one to rate poetry with its proper value. When we read certain things, right, we make our judgment. Our judgment must not be a biased one. Our judgment must not referring to the person. Our judgment must not refer to the the value of the person, and based on that his writing or information. So we supposed to read the classics. We should give the judgment based on the errors lie into it, and the we also praise based on the factuality present into it with the logic, with the proper value. Arnold here speaks about the idea of imitation. So what do you mean by imitation? That's called as a copying. He says that whatever one reads or knows keeps on coming back to him, right? So therefore, it means like I read this, and while I write certain things, so what I try to do, I try to recollect Matthew Arnold's writing and certain terms or certain statements which I copy and write on my own essay. So that's what the author pointed. He says that whatever one reads or knows keeps on coming back to him. Therefore, if a poet wants to reach the high standards of the classics, he might consciously or unconsciously imitate them. Consciously or unconsciously imitate them. So even if you want or even if you do not want, those thoughts will voluntarily come and you write. This is also true for critics who tend to revert to the historic and personal estimate instead of an unbiased real estimate. So similar to that, when people read varieties of books, right, people read personal estimates writing, and you can talk about historic estimate writings, or called as real estimates writing. So at the same time, what happened, the personal estimate and historic estimates overlap on real estimate. The historic estimates affects the study of ancient poets, while the personal estimate affects the study of modern or contemporary poets. Please do try to understand that. Historic estimate affects the study of ancient poets. It means you realize about the poets like not the modern poets, but to the ancient poets, right? Like Virgil, Homer, William Shakespeare, Aristotle, Plato, and you talk about John Donne, right? William Black, you will think about those of the poets. Personal estimate affects the study of modern or contemporary poets. So poets who have written during the 50 years ago, the kind of a writing, and the poet who are writing nowadays, you try to make the differentiation, and also based on that, you make the personal judgment, right? Let's say that people, if you ask any people like, oh, what they love to read, they will definitely take the name of the modern writers writing. Like some people say that I like Ravinder Singh. Some say that I like Chetan Bhagat. Some say that I like Paulo Coelho, right? So some say that I like Jhumpu Lahiri, right? Or some say that like these are the modern poets whose names have been come out, right? But sorry, hello.
So I said the modern poet like Sanchit Garg, Pooja Gupta.
Yeah, so these are called as a modern poet writers and modern poets, right? But at the same time, if you look into the ancient, right, a contemporary one, so you would find out the kind of a contrast, right? And how that contrast come out? Now the contrast come out because of the personal estimate. The historic estimate referring to the study of ancient points, right? While the personal estimates affects the study of writing. It's called as a modern or contemporary poets. So Arnold proposes the touchstone, right? That called as a hard method. Arnold proposes the touchstone method of analyzing poetry. How do you analyze the poetry? In order to understand and in order to go through whether it is of a high standard or not, the poetry, he borrows this method from Longinus, right? Which method he borrows? That's called as a Longinus method, right? Longinus, who said in his idea of the sublime, that's called as a godly, that if a certain example of sublimity can please anyone regardless of habits, taste, or age, and can please at all times, then it can be considered as a true example of the sublime. Sublime is also called as a calm, peace, quiet. So making the mind a heaven, right? So if any of writing is taken as an example of sublimity, despite or in spite of having the different habits or different tastes, it means I like watching horror movies and mysterious movies, right? Or called as a thrilling movies. But at the same time, if I hate watching romantic movies, but certain romantic movies, if presents me or binds my heart or change my taste, then definitely that particular movie is considered as a good movie, right? So, and that is called as a Longinus method. So if you find out any of the writing which will hold your mind in spite of your habit, taste, or age difference, right? So can be called as a true example of sublime, right? True example of sublime. This method was first suggested in England by addition. So who are they? Now one is called as addition, the other one is called as a Longinus, right? So, but it is the actual method of Longinus which is applied by addition in England, right? Who said that he would have a man read classical works which have stood the test of time and place, and also those modern works which find high praises among contemporaries, right? Now, this is a beautiful example you draw. What is that? Now, the man right, who would like to read classical works which would have stood the test of time and place. So he was the same person also loved to read modern works which find high praises among contemporaries. Right. It means you are comparing certain reading which is famous in a contemporary or which is equivalent to the contemporary. You are reading some of the classical works which have stood based on the test of time and test of place. Right. If the man fails to find any happiness in them, then he would conclude that it is not the author who lacks quality, but the reader who is incapable of discovering them. Right? Now see that if the student said that he did not like reading, right? He did not like reading, or if students say that he likes only reading modern writers, or if students say that he likes only classical reading or classical works, it indicates that the reader lacks. The reader lacks what? Now, incapable of discovery. Incapable of what? Discovering the ideas given in the writing. Arnold applies the touchstone method by taking examples from the time-tested classics and comparing them with other poetry to determine whether classics the high poetic standard whether they possess the high poetic standard of the classics or not. He says that the poems need not resemble or possess any similarity to the touchstone. That what? Poems need not, or poem is not necessary to resemble or hold any similarity to the touchstone. Touchstone method means, you understand? Once the critic has lost the touchstones in his mind in order to detect the possession of high poetic quality, he will have the tact of finding it in other poetry that he compares to the touchstones. Arnold quotes Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton in an attempt to exemplify touchstone poetry. Exemplified touchstone poetry means they are the examples. He says that the examples he has quoted, are very dissimilar to one another, but they all possess a high poetic quality. They all possess. It means Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, right, and Milton are the means you can say that carrying with or possessing with a high poetic quality. He says that a critic need not work hard or not work hard in vain trying to explain the greatness of poetry. It is not mandatory to think about the poetry. So the writer Matthew Arnold says that when we write in about any of the poem, it is not mandatory or it is not necessary to write about the poets or the writers' history. Right? It is somehow called as useless, trying to explain the greatness, right? So not labor in useless, trying to explain the greatness of poetry. He can do so by merely pointing at some specimens of the highest poetic quality. Arnold says that the high quality of poetry lies in its matter and its manner. How you present the poem and what is the subject of that poem. That matters the most. He then goes by Aristotle's observation. So please do understand that these are very important ideas. He then goes by Aristotle's observation. What is that? He says that the best form of poetry possesses high truth and seriousness. High truth. So whatever you have written is true or not, and how serious you are, that makes up its subject matter, along with the superior diction, superior wording that marks its manner. However, Arnold mentions that the true force of this method lies in its application. True force of this method lies in its application. So you know certain things, it's okay. But whether you are applying it or not, he therefore requests critics to apply the Touchstone method to analyze and rate poetry. He therefore requests critics to apply the Touchstone method to analyze and rate poetry. So how you can analyze or read the poetry? Now through the method of Touchstone. This is one. Arnold then speaks about French poetry, which had a tremendous influence on the poetry of England. So French poetry and its influence on the poetry of England. He differentiates between the poetry of northern France and the poetry of southern France. The poetry of southern France influenced Italian literature, but it is the poetry of northern France that was dominant in Europe in the 12th and 13th century, right? So this poetry came to England with the loan right. This poetry came to England with the Anglo-Normans and had a tremendous impact on English poetry. Which one? This poetry came to England with the Anglo-Normans and had a tremendous impact on English poetry. It was the Romance poems of France that was popular during that time. During that time means during the time of Anglo-Normans. But Arnold says that it did not have any special characteristics and it lacked the high truth, seriousness, and diction of classic poetry. And it remains significant or important only from the historical point of view. Next, Arnold also speaks about Chaucer. Right now, please to understand how the writer, right, Matthew Arnold, makes the segregation of the poetry in the different era. Right. So he pointed, Arnold speaks about Chaucer, who was much influenced by French and Italian poetry. Who? Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer. Right. Historic estimates. So it was the example of historic estimate. The superiority of Chaucer's poems lies both in his subject matter and his style. So, means if you talk about Chaucer's poem, so they are very popular, right? But their subject matter and because of their writing style. So he writes about human life and nature as he sees it. So whatever he sees, he tries to write the subjective matter is called as human life and the nature. Arnold speaks highly of Chaucer's diction. Arnold speaks about what? Highly of Chaucer's diction and calls that it liquid diction. So what Arnold says? Now Arnold says that Chaucer diction is considered as the liquid diction. So what is that liquid diction? Now that emphasizes the fluidity in the manner of Chaucer's writing, which he considers to be an irresistible virtue. Irresistible virtue means the something which cannot be stoppable quality, unstoppable quality. Right. Arnold, however, says that Chaucer is not a classic, right? Though his writing is somehow leading towards us, but he's not a classic. He compares Chaucer to Dante, and he points out that Chaucer lacks the high seriousness of the classics, thereby depriving of the high honor. So you can't give Chaucer the kind of means a place of classical leader. So he was not that. Next, Arnold mentions Milton and Shakespeare. So you understood that Chaucer's comparison with Dante. Next, Milton and Shakespeare. And both are credited as classics and moves on to speak about Dryden and Pope. Right. So according to the historic estimate, Dryden and Pope are no doubt great poets of the 18th century, right? So, but at the same time, Arnold observes that Dryden and Pope were better prose writer than poets. So they are not the great poets. Their writings on poem were not that famous, right? John Dryden and Alexander Pope were the better writer, prose writers, but they were not the greatest poets. The Restoration period faced the necessity of a fit prose with proper imaginative quality, and this is what John Dryden and Alexander Pope provided. Arnold therefore concludes that they are classics, not of poetry, classics of prose. So you can mention here, John Dryden and Alexander Pope were considered as the classics of prose, but not classics of poetry, right? Whereas the writer also stated about Milton and Shakespeare, they were the means they were credited with the classical poets. So, and the next one, Arnold therefore concludes that they are classics not of poetry but of prose. After John Dryden and Alexander Pope, Arnold speaks about Gray. The writer said that Gray did not write much, but what he wrote has high poetic value. Right? Arnold therefore considers Gray to be a classics. Right? Arnold now speaks about Robert Burns in the late 18th century and says that this is the period from which the personal estimate begins to affect the real estimates. Personal estimate begins to what? Not to affect the real estimate. So Burns, according to Arnold, is a better poet in Scottish than in English. It means his writing style referring to the Scotland. Like Chaucer, Arnold does not consider Burns to be a classic. Robert Burns. He says that Burns too lacks the high seriousness that is needed in a poetry. He compares Burns to Chaucer. Let me complete it.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, tell me.
Sir, it's already 11:20 and we are having our SCC class.
Yeah, I know that. Let me complete this after that. Right. So he compares Burns to Chaucer and finds that Burns' manner of presentation is deeper than that of Chaucer. So according to the real estimate, Robert Burns lacks the high seriousness of the classics, but his poetry nevertheless has a truthful substance and style. So then Arnold moves on to speak about Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth, but does not pass any judgment on their poetry. Right. So Arnold believes that his estimates of these poets will be influenced by his personal passion as they are closer to his age. It means Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth, and Matthew Arnold, they belong to the same age than the classics, and also because their writings are of a more personal nature. Finally, Arnold speaks about the self-preservation, self-saving of the classics. Any amount of good literature will not be able to stop the supremacy of the classics, as they have already stood the test of time and place, and people will continue enjoy them for the ages to come. Arnold says that this is the result of the self-preserving nature of humanity. Human nature will remain the same throughout the ages. And those parts of the classics dealing with the subject will remain relevant at all times, therefore preserving themselves from being lost in time. Right? So this is what the idea about the study of poetry, or a study of poetry written by Matthew Arnold, and his views and his opinions and his criticism on different poets, means belonging to the Anglo-Saxon, or you can say Chaucer's, and then after 18th century, like that. And he makes a variety of thought here, like Touchstone Method. So he also points out about all those three estimates that called as real estimates, personal estimates, and historic estimates. So all those things are clearly highlighting that Matthew Arnold's means deeper understanding towards the study of poetry and his criticism onto it. So that's all for the day. So we'll move for the next next topic in the next class. Till then, bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Hello. You all people should stay here.